usage is at 168,500 tons. Each of the three categories were down 26 to 28% from the previous week. The USDA releases its monthly supply and demand estimates today at 11 a.m. Central. Market expectations are for old crop U.S. soybean ending stocks to be unchanged, while new crop ending stocks are to increase to almost 424 million bushels. The carryover for old crop U.S. corn is projected to rise to about 2.3 billion bushels. Meanwhile, the carryover for new crop corn is expected to be around 2.7 billion bushels. And the markets believe the carryover for U.S. wheat will be approximately 950 million bushels. The USDA reports a trio of private sales to China this morning. The largest is a sale of about 1.37 million tons of corn, with just over half to be delivered this marketing year. There are sales of 190,000 tons of hard red spring wheat and 130,000 tons of hard red winter wheat. Both are scheduled for delivery in the coming crop year. Rounding off prices at the Chicago Board of Trade, soybean futures are steady to lower on Friday morning. The August soybean contract is down a penny at $8.96 per bushel. August soy oil is up more than 1/10 of a cent at 28.37 U.S. cents per pound. August soy meal is down $1.30 at $296 per hundredweight. Corn futures are lower Friday morning, with the September contract down 3 cents at $3.46 per bushel. Chicago oats are steady to higher, with the September contract unchanged at $2.88.5 per bushel. Wheat futures are mixed Friday morning. Chicago September is up 2.5 at $5.27.5. Kansas City September is down 2 at $4.55, and Minneapolis September is up 2 at $5.28. That's a look at the ICE futures and the Chicago markets for Friday morning, July 10th. For Markets Farm in Winnipeg, I'm Glenn Halleck.
There are no such things as small chores on your farm, so you need equipment that works as hard as you do, especially during harvest season. That's where New Holland and Butler Farm Equipment in Fort St. John come in. During New Holland Harvest Days, get terrific deals on equipment to help you work more productively. Save with 0% financing and cashback offers on select tractors, hay tools, and harvesting equipment. Stop by Butler Farm Equipment in Fort St. John today for details. But hurry, Harvest Days ends September 30th, 2020.
The opinions expressed during this show do not represent those of this station. If you've missed any of this show, you can follow the podcast at Energeticcity.ca. Now, an in-depth look at the news and information shaping our community. This is Moose Talks with your host, Doug Craig, on Moose FM.
Welcome to another episode of Moose Talks. We're going to be talking with Gary Foster, the mayor of the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, a little later on. They signed, or were awarded, I should say, an enormous community forest license with their partnership with the Fort Nelson First Nation. So we're going to talk a bit about what that means for the economy and what that means in general. To start, though, we are on the line with Dr. Nel Wieman, the acting Deputy Chief Medical Officer of the First Nations Health Authority. We're going to talk a bit about a report that came out earlier this week that says overdose deaths among First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people in BC has spiked significantly, almost doubled, in fact. She joins me on the line from West Vancouver. Good morning, Dr. Wieman.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for taking some time to talk to us today. So as I said, overdose deaths from January to May this year are at 89 First Nations people, and that's almost double what they were in the same time period last year, and only 20 shy, I believe, of what we had all of last year in the province. What does this mean in general? Because there's a lot of sort of stats that you guys put out about this and how it's affecting First Nations people a lot more than it is kind of non-First Nations people. Can you kind of explain the numbers to us a bit about what this means?
Right. So just to give a little bit of background about the opioid crisis, it has been a public health emergency that was declared by the previous provincial health officer more than 4 years ago. And First Nations Health Authority has been engaged in a number of activities and initiatives to try to reduce the numbers, the harms associated with opioid use. And over the years, since 2016, we had been showing some progress, positive progress, especially during 2019, where we saw a significant reduction in the number of deaths of First Nations people related to toxic poisoning. And unfortunately, with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, what we're seeing in 2020 so far in the first 5 months for which we have data, as you mentioned, we're seeing death rates go back to the initial, the rates that initially were seen at the time that the opioid public health emergency was declared, and quite tragic, obviously, for the families and communities who have lost loved ones too soon.
Now, as you mentioned, I mean, this has kind of been since the pandemic was kind of the onset of the pandemic. Do you have a sense as to why this time has been so difficult for First Nations people who are maybe struggling with opioid addiction, and why there has been such a surge in overdose deaths among them?
Well, I think we're going to spend probably some time looking quite deeply into, the underlying issues of why this has happened. But we do know that, with the onset of the pandemic in mid-March, that, in British Columbia, we essentially went into a lockdown of sorts, and, many places and services were closed, including some treatment centers, for example, and various harm reduction and substance use treatment programs either, closed their doors to in-person visits, and it took people a bit of time to switch to perhaps a virtual way of providing services. We also know with the messaging to stay at home and be physically distant, and initially the messaging was to be socially distant. So that message of, sort of being on your own or being by yourself seems to be related to overdose deaths that have taken place while the person who has been using alone. And then there are other issues involved with, obviously with the closing of borders and such. We know that we're dealing with a much more toxic drug supply than we were pre-COVID. So, that's just three factors of, probably many that account for what we're calling, we're talking about unintended consequences of the pandemic. And unfortunately, the number of deaths due to overdose has been one of the most tragic and negative unintended consequences that's happened.
Absolutely. Does that mean then, in a sense, and again, you sort of said there's going to be a lot of reflection and it's going to take some digging to sort of identify exactly what it was, but like a clean drug supply, if we were able to supply that, say, God forbid, there's a second wave and things kind of go back to being locked down again, would that help ameliorate the situation significantly in your view? Or do treatment centers need to find a way, as one of the examples you offered, to stay open if we have to go back to doing more physical distancing and have more physical distancing orders in place again?
Yeah, I think that the release of this data earlier this week has really provoked a lot of discussion and work that the First Nations Health Authority is doing with its partners. And certainly having people who use substances, opioids, for example, having access to safe supply is one of the potential interventions that we can offer people. In addition to, for example, providing more support, both harm reduction and substance use treatment, but also mental health services. We know that, there are many, in most cases, people who use substances have, there's a reason why they use substances. They're in pain, they're in distress, and it's related to underlying mental health issues as well. So, safe supply definitely is something that we're talking about with our partners, and there seems to be, a fair degree of support. one thing that we do need to work on, I think, is providing more education and information to potential prescribers, people who may not necessarily feel comfortable prescribing a safe supply, but realizing that what we're do by not prescribing a safe supply, we're actually perhaps contributing to deaths that may have been prevented.
Mm-hmm. Now, I wanted to dig into this a bit. As I understand, seems to be affecting primarily urban centers. When it comes to like rural kind of areas, even like the Peace region or the Northern Rockies where we happen to be, have you also, can you say, seen a change in the number of overdose deaths in rural areas? Has it also been going up? Maybe just not to the same rate as, say, urban centers like Prince George or Vancouver an area?
Yeah. I mean, what I agree with what you're saying. I mean, we do have definite what we call hot spots identified. Places where there are relatively large numbers of overdose deaths, and they tend to be centered into the larger urban areas or cities across the province. But what we do know from this latest release of data for the first 5 months of 2020 is that people have actually died due to overdose in places where we've never seen overdoses before. So again, these numbers encourage us to really come up against the stigma that we might hold about people who use substances, that it's not just people, sort of living rough on the streets or in, urban centers, like the downtown east side, and I don't want to stigmatize that community by mentioning them. But we have to overcome that stigma because substance users come from all walks of life, and they are using in their communities, in their homes, and what we're finding is that they're using alone, and so that there's no one there to administer naloxone, for example, or to get them to a healthcare center. So part of what we're going to really be working on over the next number of weeks and months is having hard conversations about that stigma. And one thought that I had mentioned earlier in the week is, with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're dealing with an infectious disease. It's literally a pandemic of disease. So people, as a whole in the province, we've done such a good job at flattening that curve that they were talking about. And that literally took place like within 3 to 4 months. We had dealt with it. The rates of community transmission right now of COVID are quite low. We have very few new cases. But this opioid crisis has also been a public health emergency. So we have dual public health emergencies. But the opioid crisis has been going on for more than 4 years. So that forces us to look at why is that? And I think part of it comes down to the messaging for the COVID pandemic is we're all in this together. But when we examine how we think about the opioid crisis, the messaging is kind of like, thank goodness it's you and not me, right? So we're not in this together. And I think that partly accounts for why, when the pandemic hit, we had this, pretty significant, drastic increase in the numbers of people who have died, unfortunately, due to the opioid crisis.
Now, as part of your press release and related to this, you mentioned systemic racism, and as I understand earlier this week, Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's investigation into systemic racism in BC's health system is kind of underway. It's going to be happening. Do you have a sense of what kind of an impact that may have on reducing perhaps the number of future overdose deaths among First Nations people if we take a hard look at ourselves and say, how is systemic racism playing a part in this?
Absolutely. We sort of have moved here at First Nations Health Authority into, for a couple of months there, we were really focused almost entirely on the COVID our public health response to the COVID pandemic. And then because of the numbers we were seeing, we again turned our attention to the opioid crisis, and now with the revelation, so to speak, about the drinking game that was played in an emergency department, has really brought the whole issue of racism, systemic racism, to the forefront. So here at FNHA, we feel like we're dealing with what our interim CEO called a trifecta of really challenging things to work on. And I don't doubt that racism plays a role in First Nations people having a reluctance to access services, particularly within the mainstream. And so people don't, they don't want to seek services, partly because of the stigma, but also because of the racism that may be experienced. And one of the things that that we've learned from this newest release of data is that from the chief coroner is that these overdoses also consist of people using multiple substances. So not just intending to use opioids, but using other substances as well. For example, alcohol. And alcohol is, one thing that in some ways it's the elephant in the room. We hesitate to talk about it because we don't want to stereotype people. We don't want to increase that stigma or reluctance to seek care. But time after time, communities identify alcohol also as a substance of priority for them that they want to see addressed. So that's something we also have plans to work on this year. We're working in partnership with the British Columbia Centre on Substance Use to develop an Indigenous supplement to the alcohol use disorder guidelines that came out provincially in November. So all of these things in combination, we are encouraging, starting yesterday, for people to participate, for First Nations people to participate in the inquiry led by Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond, and asking people to share their stories of what they've experienced. And I think it's no surprise to me and some of my colleagues, we've worked in this area for many years, but I think for the province, it's going to be, I think, quite revelatory to hear the extent and severity of poor treatment and racist treatment that people have received in the healthcare system. And the only other thing I would add is I think, I am proud that this is happening, that the discussion is finally coming to light. And I think British Columbia, by undertaking this painful, at times, examination of racism and systemic racism, will be a example for the other provinces and territories to look at themselves across the country, and then we can move forward in a reconciliation-based way as a country.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there for today. But Dr. Wieman, I really appreciate you taking a few minutes to talk to us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, we'll be right back with Gary Foster right here on Moose Talks.
You've got things to haul. You're farming, you're working in the patch or construction, and you need reliable trailers to get the job done. At Legacy Trailer Rentals, they get it. So they offer you a wide variety of trailer sizes and styles to get her done. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Gravel trailers, equipment haulers, combination trailers, they've got them and more. Call Legacy Trailer Rentals now at 780-518-1177 and check out legacytrailers.ca.
This summer at Tim Hortons, when you're craving a Tim's iced treat, we say go for it. Go for an indulgent strawberry creamy chill, a delicious Oreo iced cap, or a stronger, richer iced coffee. Go for one today, only at Tim Hortons. At participating restaurants for a limited time.
Oh, there's nothing I love more than throwing some delicious meat on the grill. And I get it all from M&M Food Market. Stop in today and check out their lineup of delicious chicken, pork, steaks, sausages, burgers, kebabs, and more. Perfect for summer grilling. And of course, I love to throw a little, shrimp on the barbie. Come on, who put this line in there? Seriously? For all your summer barbecues, head to M&M Food Market, making real food for real life. Visit mmfoodmarket.com.
Summer.
It's that season where your furnace gets to take a little break. It's also a great season to have your furnace cleaned and serviced. At Marsh & Sons, they've been cleaning and repairing furnaces in the Peace River region for over 50 years. As a locally owned family-run business, it's their goal to make sure your family is safe and warm. So this summer, let the Marsh family help your family. Book your furnace cleaning and service before fall hits with Marsh & Sons, furnace repairs and more in Fort St. John. See marshandsons.ca.
Watch this show live on Facebook or download the podcast at Energeticcity.ca.
Welcome back to Moose Talks. I'm Dub Craig. We're joined by Gary Foster, the mayor of the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality now, and we're going to talk a bit about their historically large community forest license that they were awarded along with the Fort Nelson First Nations that they are in partnership with. Good morning, Mayor Foster. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Dub. How's everything at Moose FM this morning?
Everything's well here. It's nice and sunny here. I hope it's sunny up your way, too.
It is.
Excellent.
Finally, we get some sunny weather.
Absolutely. So why don't you briefly start by telling us a bit about what this agreement entails? You're in a partnership with the Fort Nelson First Nations on this, and you were awarded the largest community forestry license in BC history, as I understand it. What does that mean? What does that kind of look like to you?
Well, the community forest in Fort Nelson, as you mentioned, is the largest community forest in the province of British Columbia, with 217,000 cubic meters of wood available for harvest. And it'll be overseen by a board of directors that's a joint board of directors between the Fort Nelson First Nations and the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. Now, this is an area-based tenure, so it's not just an amount of timber, but it is a land-based tenure. So if we don't use some of the wood in one year, we can carry it forward to another year, which is good. Once in full operation and with the resumption of local manufacturing, it'll provide revenue to the partners for reinvestment in the community, which is just key for us, so that we have this fiber available and it's providing revenue into the community. Mm-hmm. The pursuit of this agreement has also strengthened the working relationship between us and Fort Nelson First Nations, and that's very important to us going forward.
Okay. Now, what about this, as you kind of mentioned revenue, which is always very important, but what about this is better than, say, the status quo before? Because as I understand it, Fort Nelson has a long history with, having timber and logging companies and whatnot. Why is this better than sort of what came before it?
Well, we've been working long and hard to reestablish a forest company in Fort Nelson, and getting the CFA gives us joint control over a significant supply of good quality timber. Mm-hmm. It affords us a tangible asset to talk to investors about, and we can determine who we sell it to. We can use it to influence investment that will process the wood locally rather than simply ship it away. And it's a building block for jobs and the diversity of a stable economy in our area. Mm-hmm. It'll eventually provide a source of revenue to the community, and it'll help make the Northern Rockies an even better place to live. Being an active partner or player in the industry through the CF Corporation gives the partners a direct window into the industry as well, and support even better decisions as far as the utilization of our forest base goes. Mm-hmm. So that's, in a nutshell, why this is so important to us.
Was that kind of out of your control before, as in like the company would maybe, or a company perhaps, would get a license from, say, the BC government, and then you'd kind of have no control over, as you say, revenue coming in or jobs and that sort of thing? Does this just kind of help you have more influence, as you say, on kind of the harvesting of lumber in this community forest in a way that wasn't present before?
Yeah, so that's exactly it. And now we end up being, what would I say, maybe instead of tenants in our own house, we're more masters in our own house.
I see.
We get to decide how this is allocated and allocated in such a way that it maximizes the benefit to our community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, I believe in the press release, you called it the agreement a turning point in the history of the entire community. So I guess my question is, you've talked about revenue and whatnot. Do you have any sense of what the economic impact could look like, even in dollar and cents? Or is there something you're both kind of hoping for in terms of that, like a value amount?
Well, we hired Stantec, and Stantec said that this establishing a forest industry in the Northern Rockies could produce over 10 years, $5 billion, which provides a lot of tax revenue to the province and to the federal government. And you'll notice that yesterday the federal government came out and said that they are just over the COVID-19, $342 billion deficit. So, we want to help them out with this problem of their deficit. And the $5 billion of economic activity in this area, just to give you an example, that $5 billion would be enough revenue to service the debt on this entire $42 billion deficit that the federal government is running. Now, granted, not all that $5 billion would be tax revenues, but it would certainly go a long way to help the federal and provincial governments in their costs of addressing COVID-19.
Now, what's next in the process then? You have the license for this. Do you essentially kind of go on a blitz to kind of attract investment, as you say, and say, come harvest our lumber, bring your workers, build a mill or take over a mill that's already, what's next in the process for you?
Well, there's a couple of things, Dub. First of all, we talk about 317,000 cubic meters in our community forest, but that's not all the wood that's available in the Northern Rockies. In our forest district, if you take the community forest and you add it to what the other existing tenures are in our area, it comes out to 3 million cubic meters of wood. And this 3 million cubic meters, if I'm not mistaken, is the largest amount of unharvested wood volume in North America. All of North America.
Wow.
So the CF is going to be handled, as I said before, by a board of directors, and the resource is controlled by that community forest board. And they're going to continue to market that wood to potential users of that. So the mills that you hear about. And the Northern Rockies is also going to continue to market that resource to other mills or to other companies that might locate in Fort Nelson. The key thing for us is we don't want to harvest wood to throw on a railway train to send someplace else for manufacturing. We want this forest resource manufactured locally to benefit our community, of course.
Okay, well, it certainly sounds like it'd be an enormous boon to the economy in the future for the Northern Rockies and Fort Nelson area. So Fort Nelson, pardon me. Anyway, Mayor Foster, thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us and break this down with us this morning.
Well, Dub, it's been a pleasure, and anytime you want to give me a call and we can talk about other issues in the Northern Rockies, I'm glad to make the time.
Sounds good. All right, we'll be right back to wrap things up right here on Moose Talks. The City of Fort St. John and Napit Industries would like to advise the public that 100th Street will be closed at 96th Avenue until October 1st. Detour routes are in place. Please follow posted signage and the direction of traffic control personnel at all times when you're in the area. 100th Street will be closed between 95th Avenue and 97th Avenue until October 1st. All businesses will remain open and accessible at all times. The City of Fort St. John and Napit Industries thank you for your patience while we continue to improve our city.
Now that you've got time to focus on money-saving ideas, let's draw your attention to the lights on the top of your tower. Did you just change them not too long ago? Petron Communications can help you out so that you can keep your eyes on the ground and not have to look up again. Changing your incandescent tower lights to energy-efficient LED housing will save you money on power, and you'll never have to change those lights again. In times like these, it's wise to find ways to cut expenses, and this is a bright idea that lasts. Petron Communications, ready to do the work today so your future will be lit tomorrow.
If you're looking for hassle-free internet services, call the Peace Region Internet Society today. With coverage throughout most of the Peace, PRIS can get you connected quickly without the hassle of contracts or bundles. Visit PRIS.ca or call 1-800-768-3311 for more information.
Hi, this is Ted with PIMS Production Equipment. Talk to us at PIMS for electrical work, air compressors, pumps, valves, relief valves, office phones, and computer networks. Experience the best in service. Check us out at PIMS.ca or call PIMS at 250-787-0808.
Quiznos has brought back their Greek gyro. Enjoy seasoned beef and lamb, crumbled feta, banana peppers, crisp lettuce, and red onions topped with tzatziki sauce on a flatbread, sub, Sammy, or in a salad. The Greek gyro is back. Try one today at Quiznos, beside Walmart.
Our community first. This is Moose Talks with Dub Craig on Moose FM.
Our thanks again to Dr. Nel Wieman from the First Nations Health Authority and Gary Foster, the Mayor of the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, for joining us to talk today. If you happen to have missed this episode or you'd like to hear it or watch it again, you can check out, or rather download the podcast at energeticcity.ca/Moose Talks, or check out the video on the Moose FM and Energeticcity.ca Facebook pages. They will be available to rewatch shortly. Moose Talks is produced by Adam Rayburn with studio production by Lindsay Cooper. I'm Dub Craig. Be well.
Join us next Friday at 10 a.m. for another episode of Moose Talks, a weekly talk show about Fort St. John and the North Peace.
Energetic